Hi, Michael. Hi, Alex.
Hey, Karen.
Hi, Karen.
It's good to finally have you two together. I think you
Y-
listen to each other and make comments, but
Yeah, it's great. We haven't really talked. Well, we haven't talked. We just exchanged a couple of emails, so it's good to be
yeah.
able to finally talk.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
Okay, so what I've been thinking about lately a lot is information. And I've talked before about my kind of picture about how information works in the universe, but I've been especially noticing lately that there's so much information all around us all the time. I know I'm inundated with it on a daily basis. There's so much information coming at us from the internet and from newly published books and YouTube, and we're drowning in it. And none of that information ever becomes useful or applicable unless we act on it, unless we do something. So the information is coming in, but then that's one of the reasons that we are bodies, because our body embodies the idea and then we act upon it and it becomes real. And it's either a success or a failure. It's a very binary thing, right? It's either a zero or a one. But we can't learn anything unless we try it out. I mean, I discovered that with painting. And I can watch lots of videos on painting, but until I actually put the brush on the canvas and slop some paint around, I'm not really learning anything about painting.
Hmm.
So I wanted to talk just about this idea about how information becomes reality and what can be learned in the process of that, and look at it from the standpoint of both symbolic thinking, symbolic communication, and also from the standpoint scientifically of quantum mechanics. And so I'm just
Hmm.
going to throw that out there. Let's toss around this idea of symbol first. Let's think about symbol first. So why do we use symbol in communication? Why is symbol even a thing? Why don't we just use words?
Yeah, I think Michael should talk about that a little bit since he's kind of addressed that a little bit in the past.
Yeah, well, I think the symbol, when I think of that word, I think of it as a kind of coming together between, this is like Jonathan Pageau's kind of language, but it's like a coming together of heaven and earth. So it's a common, it is the archetype and the thing coming together. So in some sense, I think you could think of words themselves, they're symbols as well, or even our our human bodies are symbols. Um, and so I think the reason we have to use the symbols is because I see them fundamentally as like some sort of a data compression. You know, it's a data structure that allows us to it helps us to get it down into to small enough slots that we can communicate things that would otherwise take a long time in a shorter time frame, but it also allows us to have them compressed into forms that survive longer periods of times culturally, so that we can kind of pass on things that we know. I think a lot of times it's interesting, you can't articulate a lot of the things you know, but they're still embodied in these symbols in ways that make themselves manifest as you kind of interact with them. Is kind of how I see it.
I guess I want to jump sort of right to what you're saying there, Karen, about uh, quantum physics and in the context of what Michael just said about the embodiment of information. And it seems like and then all the information that we're bombarded with, it's very confusing. It's become chaotic in a lot of ways. And so we've kind of lost, as I think Pageau has also said, we've lost this symbolic language that we all speak in common. And in some sense, we each have our own individual symbolic language that only we understand. But I also see a real big difference, because Karen, you brought up younger people. And I'm really seeing this big difference between generations in terms of symbolically. I've noticed young people speaking a very different language with each other, and it's a mimetic language. There's all these memes on the internet, on social media, Snapchat, and the different platforms. Yeah. And I've noticed, and my daughter has commented to me on this, that when they get together in face-to-face conversation, she's observed that her friends and her are speaking in memes. They speak and they say they'll see something happen, like a dog chases a cat or something, and they will reference a meme that they had seen, that their group, has collectively or commonly seen in common, this particular meme, and they look at each other and they all know before a word is said even what they're all thinking. It's almost like nonverbal communication, but it's because that's their language that they've learned, and it's these language of, it's different than the language I know. So I think it's, in some sense, it lacks action, but it's sort of self-referential, or it's referencing this digital realm of situations that are depicted in very short sound bites, essentially, or video bites. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
No, I want to pursue that. Hold on just a second. I have to close my window. There's a lot of noise going on outside. I'm going to pause the thing here.
So it seems like generationally, we, the three of us, are sort of, I don't know what all of our ages are, but I think we sort of fall into maybe three different ranges of experience.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of my experience. I'm wondering, like, Michael, I don't know if you have kids or not, or, like I said, I'm interested in what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, with the internet, say, like in the high school time frame. So I didn't really, it came to me late in life and it certainly, in my own personal experience, didn't play a formative role in terms of social interaction, in an adolescent period, where I think you kind of learn a lot of the rules of how you interact with your peer group. But I do think it's interesting, even watching on the Discord server. I don't know if you guys have spent much time on there with Paul's community at all. Have you?
I've jumped on a little bit, but
yeah,
because I'm of another generation, it's harder for me to navigate it.
It is a bit chaotic for myself as well. I find it a bit overwhelming to kind of like where to step into that stream of consciousness kind of going on. But it's funny too. Like, I feel like, the ways in which people use, like, they call them, like a GIF or a GIF, which is like just an animated loop. A lot of times it's like a celebrity or somebody like that's portraying a certain emotion in a reaction. Mm-hmm. And that's their way of kind of, through this digital medium, interjecting, some sort of like humanity into it in a certain sense. But I remember, like, when I watch that stuff, I wonder to what extent are we getting, we're getting really good at recognizing these things, but is that the same as being able to embody them? Are we, and in some sense, it's easier to just post that little GIF of this particular emotional reaction to something. But the back of my head, I'm like going, is the person really having that emotion reaction, or is this kind of like a substitute for it? I don't know the answer to that question,
Yeah.
because I feel like, again, I don't live in that stream myself. I find it, overwhelming, and I kind of dip my toe in the water and then kind of jump out, because it's if I let myself get carried away with it, I find it fairly disorienting.
I think that's a really good question, Michael, because I think about, like, I have a 25-year-old daughter, and she certainly lives in this mimetic world and communicates that way. And to some extent, I've learned to communicate that way with her, and I recognize the little jokes and understand the humor that goes on there and so forth. But when you brought that up, Michael, about these little, I think I call them gifts because it sounds better to me. These little gifts that represent somebody's reaction to something that happened. It is really easy to let that be your own reaction and never have to think about your own authentic emotional response to something, and never have to articulate it. And I really wonder what's going to happen to the ability to communicate. I mean, I've noticed, just if I've been rereading The Graves of Academe by Richard Mitchell. He's the same guy that wrote the book Less Than Words Can Say, and he was writing back in the 80s about the collapse of the English language and just how we've gotten into this bureaucratic language, scientific language, but we've gotten away from really the kinds of deep, meaningful communication that you say might have been in one of Winston Churchill's inspirational speeches during World War II, for example, whereby the words that he used, he was able to convey a passion and an inspiration to an entire generation of people to go out and preserve the world. And we don't have that anymore. I mean, even the best political speeches are just made up of cliches.
Well, I think there's two things that just made me think of. There's one is there's a lack of vulnerability. So that bureaucratic scientific kind of language is a way to kind of, you can say a lot without being vulnerable. And then the other component of that is that you're like, there's no commitment to action. So you're not really committed to any specific action. So there is no real promise of an embodied state that will be tested in some real fashion. And you see this with politicians all the time. You can run on a platform of X, and whether that, embodies, what you would actually do once you get into office, nobody, we don't even have the kind of socially conscious, time scale of to be able to measure that, because we're already on to something new by the time you're in office. And, there is that disconnect there that's very kind of concerning.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the no commitment to action thing makes me think about how much today's language, so much of what's written is written in the passive. So nobody has agency. Nobody's taking responsibility for anything. And I find myself doing it all the time. I can lapse into the passive just because I don't have to think about, well, who is the actor in this case? Who is responsible for this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about where this is modeled, or where like you mentioned, Winston Churchill. It's kind of out of left field, but The Wizard of Oz. I recently heard an analysis of The Wizard of Oz by Seth Godin, who's a well-known marketing expert and writer, very well read. Anyway, he was talking about how Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz is one of the very few female hero archetypes that are heroic figures that weren't in some way portrayed as somehow the fact that she was a girl wasn't really an issue. It wasn't brought up, but she was very decisive and very action oriented. And he pointed out that there was only two places in the movie, or in the book, I guess. I never read the book. I just watched
The books
the
are
movie.
great. I read them all when I was a kid.
Yeah, but I've seen the movie probably 10 times. It was like a tradition to watch that. You know, we had the 3 or 4 channels on TV, and that's all we had.
Mm-hmm.
And The Wizard of Oz would come on the same
year.
time every year. Yeah, so we'd always watch it. And but yeah, Dorothy she accidentally killed the 2 witches.
Mm-hmm.
But everything else she did was on purpose, was intentional. And she always was very decisive. She said, okay, well, let's go here and let's do that. And she was very much a leader in that movie.
I would guess you could say the only time that they showed that she was a girl was when she made a big deal about her pretty red shoes.
Yeah, that's true. But she wasn't, like overly distraught, about, not that I'm not saying that that's that's a female thing. It's just the often portrayed, meme of what it means to be a female, in our media, in our culture. And she wasn't portrayed in that way as that meme. And so that was, anyway, he pointed out that was maybe one of the last highly influential female heroes that wasn't memified or by the stereotypical behaviors, maybe male or female.
Well, to some extent, I think that history's been rewritten a little bit by the people who are all upset about all these things, because when I was younger, it was my job to do the ironing in our household. In those days, we used to iron the sheets. Can you believe that? The sheets and the pillowcases had to get ironed along with everybody's, pants and shirts and all that kind of stuff. And that was my job when I was like 10 years old, was to do the ironing, especially in the summer. And so I would turn on the TV and I'd watch all these old movies. So these old movies from the 1940s and 50s would be playing on TV because there wasn't any new programming in the 60s. And a lot of those old movies had very remarkable female heroes that were very forthright and decisive. And I'm not exactly sure when the tide shifted, but I kind of remember maybe around the time of the Gidget movies starting up in the 60s or something. Then everything turned towards these in fact, I kind of think the whole feminist movement brought in this whole sexualization of women and made all the movies very much the sexualized woman, and made all the plots wrap around that, where before that they were a lot of, especially the movies coming out of the Second World War, showed a lot of women. They weren't war heroes in the sense of being in combat, but they certainly were heroes in the sense of the nursing and the other side jobs that they did, or just maintaining things on the home front during the war. Mrs. Miniver, a lot of movies like that were just very heroic.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, like everything else, the history gets rewritten, and the way things are written about by the culture erases a lot of things that actually happened, and the only people that know it happened are the people that still remember. When my generation is gone and there's nobody to remember anymore, I don't know what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, unless it's been made into a rerun and and played on. And how are people going to find it? If there's infinite choice of what to watch, and attention span has been narrowed down to these real short, humorous, or emotion-filled rants or something like that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'm sorry I got a little bit off track there. We were back talking.
Yeah.
We were talking about the Okay, so because everything is very chaotic right now, we've lost the symbolic language that we all speak in common. That was your comment, Alex. And then Michael, you said that these things show a lack of vulnerability and no commitment to action. And I was thinking about other ways in which symbols are used in our world. I mean, I agree that this whole thing about the mimetic language and the gifts is reducing our potential, I think, to communicate on a deeper level in the future. Because if the new generation aren't learning to access their own emotional response, and they aren't learning to communicate that, and they aren't learning how to organize their ideas and communicate their ideas in ways that are accessible and powerful, then I don't know where we go as a culture. But the other ways in which I see symbol being used seem to me, so there's two ways symbol can go. It can either go towards the cliche, or it can go towards the something that's deeply meaningful. So in terms of the cliche, I see symbols used for like logos to represent companies. Symbol is used for mascots to represent a sports team, emojis to represent smiley faces and hearts and, you know, all the different kitty cats and doggies and everything. Political symbols, slogans, and all those things seem to cheapen communication rather than deepening it. So what is it that defines a deeply meaningful symbol, or what is it that separates deeply meaningful symbols from these cheap shot type symbols that are just an easy way to communicate? Like the mimetic language is just an easy way to communicate a shared experience without actually having to share an experience, without actually having to interact with each other face to face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I was thinking about I don't know, maybe this is related, the sort of how symbols came about in the first place, and whether you look at things coming from emerging from chaos. Let's just say something like the game of life, where you have these simple agents that come together, and maybe they're like circles or lines, where they're linked to certain noises that are made in certain situations. I'm thinking about, going way back to the beginning of language, and you can look at structure sort of emerging out of chaos, like we see order emerging from chaos according to simple or individual particles or agents acting according to very simple rules, and then things, complex form emerging out of that. Like, for example, in the game of life, or something like Stephen Wolfram's, where he went through and made a catalog of all the different initial conditions of particles and the different simple rules that they can behave by, and then all the graphical don't call them symbolic, but the patterns, the complex patterns that form, all the possible ones that form out of these different sets of simple rules and initial conditions. And so in one sense, there's this emergent manifestation of things that we came to call symbols, that represent thoughts and language and actions and emotions and all these things that are very situational and of the world. And then on the other hand, there seems to be a sense that in which these symbols emanate, they give something, and maybe that what those types of symbols give are something that isn't necessarily related to action that we've seen, or history, things that we've seen in the world, but are more related to something that more akin to imagination or an experience of the numinous that we have, that we may have had. And it just seems like as our language has become progressively more and more deconstructed and turned toward making finer and finer distinctions of things scientifically, and to the point to where I think we've lost sense of objective truth or objective meaning. Our symbols that we come to see are more representative of that banal ambiguity that Michael was talking about in the language, in the political language, in the bureaucratic language, and so that it seems like the symbols are more that we see and that we relate to are more of that character, as opposed to the characters, the symbols that are more of an emanation, or they have an emanatory information to give us.
I found it interesting your comment there about symbols can have this life of their own. It made me think a lot of Barfield's idea about words having kind of souls that contain within them kind of this history of all the ways in which previous consciousness have used those things, so that they're kind of like there's like an accretion over time in the word that that has all this built up meaning in it that we can kind of reinvestigate. It seems to me, though, that with the differentiation between that symbol becoming something kind of dead and lifeless versus something alive, it has to go. It goes back to the intention with which we're using it. And I think a lot about, like, say, so I thought about recently, like what role we play in terms of being sub-creators, in terms of creating the world. And so these symbols that we use, we can imbue them with this kind of life, depending on our intentions with how we use them. And kind of, we can, like a piece of art can be this wellspring of life, or it can also be this kind of deconstruction of life, depending on what our intents are in doing it. And it seems like one of the things that I think of is this intention towards the truth that that Peterson talks about, which in some sense you can't even have that as an intention unless you believe that the truth is real. And I think that's something that's rapidly being lost, that the truth is something that, in Jordan's frame, again, you can't get to the truth, but you still have this moral responsibility to try and aim in that direction, even though you can't get there. Whereas today there's a sense in which some sort of absolute truth doesn't exist, and the only proximate, substitute is these, scientific or bureaucratic, truths that nobody sees as absolute in any measure in terms of, fulfilling something. So it's you have to have some sense that truth is something that is out there that can be encountered, that you were in some sense made to encounter it and to be a sub-creator or an articulator of it. If you don't have that as an intention and a belief in the activities in which you're doing, you almost necessarily fall into whatever these other patterns are that are kind of deconstructing the world around us that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think about what it all comes down to as far as how these ideas are played out has to do with their usefulness, and like what is seen, what is the usefulness of regarding an image as a wellspring of information, of enriching, life affirming connection, relation to nature, relation to God, relation to each other, versus this deconstruction of objective truth and sort of a wink and a nod to anarchy, to sort of a shared sense of camaraderie and within an anarchy, a connection to anarchy or something like that, or deconstruction, of authority and object, absolute truth. And I mean, to me, it seems like there's a usefulness in terms of identification. Like if you, I mean, I think our need and our desire to connect is extremely strong and powerful. And so if there's sort of like low hanging fruit out there to glom onto and identify with, then that's what's going to happen for a lot of people that don't have sort of the more enriching exposure to the more enriching aspect of regarding images or symbols that portray more of an emanatory wellspring of life of affirming information, and that maybe the church used to provide, or our families used to provide, or local cultures used to provide. And so I think, I mean, none of us have really discussed like any kind of like mission or agenda or anything like that for these discussions. But I think that there's something maybe unspoken, and that's fine that it's unspoken, because I think that's kind of the point to me, is that we're sort of exploring these ideas and seeing what emerges through them, being open and free to say things on any different topic and go where they will. But I guess me personally, I just really feel like if there are going to be meaningful symbols that are meaningful to people, then they have to be perceived as useful somehow. And it almost makes me feel like there's the need of a trickster archetype or something like that, to say, and I think that we've seen this, like when I mean, I'm just for example, like when anybody, like an artist or somebody who wants to make a movie or write a story that they're wanting to get across a moral point, and they have to like get together in a room and discuss how they're going to make it hip, how they're going to make it relatable and hip and with the culture and all this, so that people will be sort of fooled into paying attention to it and hopefully will absorb the moral intention behind it.
Yeah, I kind of think that's the path that we've been on. That's kind of the path to destruction.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about our need and our desire to connect and how meaningful that is, and I see that especially with, I mean, this is true in every generation, but in this younger generation where there's so much connection through the internet, and also where a lot of the education has been promoting the deconstructionist idea of the postmodernists and all of those ideas. Now that's the hip thing, is to think that way. And that hipness has been moving into the church. It's been moving into a lot of different ways that communities operate, because if you want to be known as the one who's hip and cool and you fit in with everybody, you've got to kind of go down that road of deconstructing everything, not taking anything seriously. There's no real truth. How can you know truth? I mean, all of that talk. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that that's what generates real interest in people. I mean, this idea we have to make ourselves relevant. Actually, the real people who are really thinking, when they look at that, they go, not so sure. If you're having to be relevant, then there must not be anything real there. And I think what people are really looking for is something they can give their lives for. People are really looking for something where I'm willing to die for this idea. I know that sounds extreme, but I'm thinking about when my older daughter was in youth group in church back in the 80s. A lot of other churches at that time were going the route of having everything be relevant and meaningful, and they're having lots of fun activities for the kids, and everything is rah-rah. But the particular youth group leader that was in our church was very committed to these kids, and he taught them, Jesus Christ is worth your life. Taking a stand is worth giving up your life for, because this is truth. And that band of kids went out into the world, and a lot of them got involved in doing very meaningful things. I don't know if they're all still involved in that, but I certainly saw something different there than I saw in later years with the rah-rah hip relevance movement in the youth groups, because that turns out a lot of people who, rightly so, think, if you have to make this all into a big party, why am I here? There's better parties elsewhere. You know, this isn't, I can go get a keg, I can go, get a hit of marijuana or something and have a better party than whatever party you're producing here. And if that's all this is, then why bother?
Yes. And I wonder if we're not, if that, what we're talking about is like that was sort of modernity, and then post-modernity would be sort of even the deconstruction of that, and this and the felt abyss, or the vacuousness, of that party scene or whatever's the happening thing, not fulfilling that need for sacrifice, to give sacrifice, to have meaning, and then not having anything to come in and fulfill that role. And we're sort of maybe in that. Maybe it's good news, essentially, that we're in a place where things are almost getting too intolerable, even for the anarchists to handle,
Well, now speaking the truth is an act of rebellion, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I like this idea that meaningful symbol has to be based on truth. That there has to be a recognition that truth exists before we can even consider, before we can have an intention to discover the truth. We have to believe that the truth exists. Now, I wonder what the reductionist scientists, the strictly materialist scientists, I wonder what is really their underlying presumption, because they keep, they're very avid about pursuing the structure of reality, if there is a reality. I mean, I've even run into a lot of quantum physicists lately who are saying there is no such thing as reality, Donald Hoffman among them. But they're avid about pursuing something. They can't call it the truth because they don't really believe that there is a truth that exists. They can't call it reality that they're pursuing because they don't really, a lot of them don't really believe that reality exists. So I really wonder, what is it that keeps them moving forward to continue trying to find more and more answers?
I think fundamentally it boils down to some sort of pursuit of godlike powers, of both knowledge and control. It seems to be what underlies this pursuit. I mean, and you can kind of suss it out too when they just the way they talk once they get outside of their scientific disciplines, and what sort of things they find, what sort of theories they find attractive versus unattractive. And once they get into the realms of speculation and they don't have real hard science to back up what they're saying, but they're kind of just, coming off the cuff and seeing what they think might be the case. I think I see most of the people in the scientific world, they have a trajectory of us eventually being sort of like gods of the world, in terms of our knowledge and control. And that's seems to be the aim. That seems to be what's pushing a lot of people forward. And there's kind of an assumption that we'll get there eventually. If you've ever heard like Elon Musk talk about his ideas about the probability of us being a simulation, he'll say things like, well, it's pretty likely that we are, because if you just assume any sort of progress over time, even if it's a very small percentage over time, that percentage compounds and you eventually get to the point where you have the technology to simulate whole worlds and things like that. So there's this presumption of just unending progress. That's I don't know, and everybody wants to be the I don't know, the persons that's written into the annals of science as the person that like made their contribution to that progress, I guess.
Yeah.
That's kind of like the God, I guess, is that progress.
Mm-hmm.
It is getting interesting, though, that the further along that they get in this, the more they have to start using language that sounds as though they're talking about something with agency. They start. I was listening to John Hagelin. You familiar with him?
I'm not.
Oh,
No.
He's a quantum physicist, but he's also deep into transcendental meditation, and he is one of these physicists that believes that, well, he's a string physics and M theory. This idea that the underlying structure of reality is like this ocean of effervescing bubbles that's always tossing about these strings that are somewhat like rubber bands. And these strings, the way that a rubber band moves in space, kind of represents the different wave functions. And all of these have harmonics. And he went into this in-depth explanation of string theory, which I had never watched before. But when he starts talking, he talks about nature. Nature does this and nature does that. So what is nature? I mean, nature has a lot of agency for something that just arises out of this bunch of strings. And Henry Stapp is another quantum physicist, and the two of them were discussing. And it was actually an interview of Henry Stapp, who's a much older quantum physicist. And he was saying that the brain creates possibilities, and the brain is always, there's something called these ion channels in the molecules that are in our brain. and the ions of calcium and other sorts of mineral things shoot through these ion channels, and because the channels are very small, when it shoots through there, coming out the other side, it sort of spatters out, and so it's always spattering out these like almost infinite possibilities in the brain of where the wave function is going to go next in terms of our decision-making process. And that those wave functions only collapse when they're observed by the mind. So the mind has to be observing the collapsing wave function in order for our human person to even decide what they were talking about. When we make an observation of a wave function collapsing, the part of we that's making the observation is our brain being operated by our mind. So the mind is observing the collapsing wave function in the brain so that the brain can decide which thing to observe in the collapsing wave function in the universe. But he was saying that there's two groups here. There's all of the observers, which is all of us. Those of us who have consciousness are the observers. And then there's nature. So those are the only two things that exist in the world. And, when they go down that road, they start using language. It just sounds a lot like they're talking about God. And in fact, John Hagelin would really more or less talk about it as God, but he's talking about it as ultimate mind. There's just this ultimate mind that is percolating up with cosmic joy, constantly percolating up these little bubbles that are actually little bubbles that have the potential of becoming another universe. And yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah. I was just reading about some Plato, an analysis of that, the allegory of the cave, and it just seems like it's amazing to me that we're still sort of thinking about the same things, or that people, there were people way back then that were thinking about the things that we're thinking about today. But in terms of, like in the allegory, people are chained to the floor, made to look at this wall upon which shadows are cast, and they mistake the shadows for reality. And maybe there's sounds that come in from behind that echo off the wall, making the sounds appear to come out of the shadows. So there's no concept at all about the opening of the cave, that there's anything behind them at all. And one of them breaks free and is able to go out of the cave, and then they see, in Plato's account of it, they see the world as we see it, and they see the light, they see the sun. And he references what that is a higher form of reality, is, but I don't know that he explicitly says it, but the light is shining on the objects outside the cave, and yes, that's a higher reality than what the shadows are, and related to what Hoffman's idea about the icons and all that, of seeing like as if what we see is you can't trust because it's just an icon, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's what Plato was saying too, that all we're seeing is shadows, so that there's this higher level of reality that is seeing light shown directly on objects. But then, and I don't think that he, to my knowledge, goes a step further and says that the light itself, the sun itself is sort of this ultimate reality, contains all of the information, and is this even higher level, or perhaps the ultimate level of truth and knowledge of reality. And that we can't, I'm just saying this, we can't look at it directly. It burns our eyes. We can't see it. But there's some sense in which it seems like we're constructing in our imagination ways to, like, okay, so how did that person get outside of the cave, right? Did they break the physical chains? Or maybe they used their imagination to break out, and they were imagining what was behind them. And then there is such a thing that as another reality that existed behind them, and they went up and explored that in their imagination.
And what is it that even motivates a person to try to break free from the chains and find out if there's another reality?
Yeah. Well, we seem to have this, desire to know, and maybe this idea of being godlike, on the one hand, maybe it's about, for some people, it's about becoming godlike and having the power that you possess by possessing knowledge, superior knowledge, let's say, or the first person to possess or to understand something that no one else has understood before.
Well, apparently in Paradise Lost, it's been a long time since I read it, so I don't remember this, but Jordan Peterson says that the character of Satan in Paradise Lost is represented as the one who is sure that he has all the knowledge that he needs and doesn't need anything outside of himself. And
he talks about it specifically as the rational intellect that falls in love with its own creation and sees them as complete.
Yes.
Which makes it, I was just reading something today about speaking back to the godlike aspect, in some sense that was the original sin of Adam, was that he was content to be godlike, to get close enough, but really what our true goal, if you look at the kind of arc of history that the Bible lays out, is eventual union with God. So in some sense we are, it's picking up on a desire that's legitimate in some sense, but that we become satisfied with some proximate version of it, godlike, but not the full self-sacrificial union with God.
Yeah.
Right, it's the shortcut, right? The shortcuts
exactly
require the suffering.
But the thing is, whenever you do come into real contact with the transcendent, it always changes you, because you can't, in some sense, be unaware of your own deficiencies and limits, and how much the deficiencies of what become very apparent when you encounter the transcendent. And then Jordan Peterson points this out, that this always manifests itself to us in error. So in some sense, if we aren't living lives intentionally with action, we don't ever cross those boundaries into areas where we were just plain wrong, and we feel the full weight of that wrongness, so that we have an experience of what transcendent reality is, versus these safe spaces we've cobbled together that are very risk adverse, and you're not really doing anything, you're never really and having to be vulnerable or take action, you kind of can avoid that altogether, while maintaining some sort of idea of the pristine quality of your own ideas, that they're all right.
I would say that it's I agree. In one sense, it is when we've erred or sinned, and and have regret, and we see that, but it's also in another way, where we feel the absence of, or we feel like I'm trying to find the right words here, but sort of a lack of meaning, or a lack of, there's almost like a darkness, or a sense of falling into the abyss or something like that, where it's a vulnerability that comes out of that could open you up to being not just saved in the sense that you're pulled up into more like a righteous position from where you were, but like a safe, like someone's holding you, someone's safe, is making you safe and preventing you from not falling in terms of sin, but falling in terms of falling into a sort of an abyss of meaninglessness or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that abyss, this kind of goes back to the notes we had. It's that reciprocal narrowing, where your circle's getting smaller and smaller, and the abyss is kind of falling into that narrowing of possibility and meaninglessness. Whereas the inverse is true when we are kind of approaching God, that we're getting away from ourselves, and our sense of possibilities are being expanded, and our sense of what we don't know being greater than what we do know is consistently being expanded as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so could I clarify that a little bit, Michael?
Sure.
So you're talking about, when you talk about the reciprocal narrowing and the reciprocal broadening, are you going back to what John Vervaeke was talking about when he was?
Yeah, I think it's related, but it's also related to that G.K. Chesterton quote about the insane man is like can't get away from himself because his circle's too small. I think they're both, it's the same kind of idea. You're kind of, you're so focused on yourself that each turn around the circle, you become tighter to that center. And in your sense of possibilities, and you're so certain that the way you see the world is the way it actually is. And it's this dismal view of things, and you're certain that it's right. And that's kind of how I conceive it.
So then I want to take that with what you said earlier about when you encounter the transcendent, you become aware of your own deficiency. You can't help but become aware of your own deficiency. And I've been reading off and on things I never thought I would before, but about people who are trying psychedelic products, and that sometimes just 1 or 2 doses of a psychedelic will convince people that there is another reality, that there is a deeper spiritual reality because of the experience that they have inside their own minds. But I never hear them talk about this kind of experience. Like,
what kind of experience?
Well, so if you're actually encountering the transcendent, from what you said, you can't help but become more aware of your own deficiency.
Well, I think it's both at the same time, right? So for instance, my understanding of the way, I think Jordan Peterson said this, that the hallucinogens act on your brain is that they inhibit in some regard your use of memory. So the filter that you typically have overlaid on the world and your beliefs about yourself and the world, they're kind of temporarily inhibited, which gives you a moment of actually seeing it in a kind of raw, unfiltered manner. That raw, unfiltered manner really blows away your ideas about the world and what it, you suddenly are seeing things in a very, so it does, in a sense, makes you aware of how your old model was deficient, right? But it's also an optimistic event for a lot of people because it's also this huge landscape of possibilities that's just opened up to you that were there before, but you couldn't see them. And so now it's suddenly made manifest to yourself in a very tangible, direct way. Like your senses are alive with it. What you're experiencing is something new and fresh, even though you're looking at the same room or the same landscape you were just looking at before you took the drug. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. That totally makes sense because, yeah. So let me shift a little bit here over to, I want to go back to this thing about quantum mechanics, and I want to throw an idea at you guys. Now, this is a idea that's just inside my very simple brain, so you have to be patient with me because I never took physics. So I could be 100% wrong here, but I also think that in all of these things that there are truths that relate on many different levels. And so this level of quantum reality, I think there are ways in which that is symbolic of other parts of the universe that we know. So anyway, according to quantum theory, we can't know where the wave or the particle is until we measure it, right? We can only know the probabilities of where it will be. That's what they say. And that once we observe it, it concretizes into a particle, and then we know where it is at that moment. Now, this puzzles me that they think that this is such a big aha, because we can't ever know the future until it happens. So wherever that wave is, that's in the future. I mean, at the moment that we observe it, when we make plans to observe it, we're making plans to look at it at some moment that is in front of this moment. It's future to, I have a thought, oh, I'm going to observe it. I haven't observed it yet. So I haven't observed it yet. Of course, I can't know where it is because I don't know the future. So I don't understand why they expect to be able to know where it is. It isn't anywhere until you observe it. It isn't anywhere until the future happens. So I don't know how to explain this, but I mean, the future happens moment by moment in front of me, and it hasn't happened yet, and it's going to happen in a moment. And when that moment comes, I'm observing the wave or particle, and I know where it is now, of course, because now it's present. It's not future anymore, it's present. But if I decide to observe another particle, that is also future until I observe it. And then once I observe it, it's present. So in a sense, the observations, measurements and so forth are concretizing reality as we move through it, right? I mean, that's kind of the way it seems in my mind, and it doesn't seem all that surprising to me. So I don't understand why the quantum physics makes a big deal out of this and saying that this somehow remakes the structure of reality, because it doesn't seem all that different to me than the way I've always thought about reality.
I think the big thing why physicists balk at it is because if you look at theories of general and special relativity, they within that framework at the large scale, it has predictive powers down to we can say it like the 100th of a second after the Big Bang happened, we know these things were going on with some degree of statistical certainty.
But that was in the past.
Right, that happened in the past, but it can also tell us, okay, our sun is going to blow out at this particular time period, or this the heat death of the universe is going to happen so far out this way, at least within our observable frame of it, or something like that. It has this and within relativity, you can play time backwards and forwards like with a math equation, and you get very precise predictions about what's happening. And so I think the sort of people that are drawn to that kind of certainty are all they've gone into physics, and they've they find it unsettling that this space level, this, at the small level, that we don't have the mathematical models don't give us that degree. This was the thing, who was Einstein? He didn't like the quantum stuff because he always said God doesn't play dice, and the probabilistic nature of the quantum fields always, to him, seemed like a rolling of the dice in some sense.
Well, see, it doesn't seem that way to me. So, but I don't have Einstein's mind either. The probabilistic nature of it is just that anytime you think about the future, you have to think all things being considered. All things being considered, maybe the sun won't burn out for another 13 billion years, but it's not outside the realm of possibility that some rogue planet from some other galaxy far away could come hurling through our universe and knock our sun off course, and it would burn out faster. I mean, you don't know, because the future hasn't happened yet, right? And we don't know the future. It has to always be probabilistic. I mean, only God knows the future. So, and I don't even think that God knows the future in the sense that God determined the future. It's just that he is outside of space and time. So everything is always now for him. But I don't understand why anyway. But so thinking about that, I had this little theory. So we have all these waves. Everything's a wave. And if you can imagine the whole universe as all these waves, and these waves are just moving along. And let's try to imagine that there's a wall, not a wall, like a big, I don't know, force field maybe, or a field of some sort that's in front of us that these waves can move through. But that field that's in front of us is the border between now and the future. So there's a border that, so you know how the universe has been moving out since the Big Bang, and they can see where they can supposedly see where the end of the discernible universe is at this point as it's been moving out. Beyond that, there's some sort of a boundary. So that's on a macro scale for the universe. But let's just say that in our own reality here, there's also some sort of a boundary where the not yet has not happened yet, and that boundary, these waves are moving through. And when these waves move through that boundary, at that moment in time, if you took a snapshot of that, what you would see are just particles. All you'd see are the end of the wave, or the point in the wave where it went through the screen, like this. All you would see are those points. So of course they would appear to be particles when you observe it, when you take a picture of it. In the same way that when you take a picture of waves on a pond, or you take a picture of ocean waves, it takes away all the magic and all the beauty of them, because it stops them in that fluidity and that motion that they had. But if we're moving through time, and time is an actual essence that we're moving through, at every moment in time, there is a natural concretizing of everything at all times as we move through it. Does that make sense?
I think it kind of does. I mean, these are very abstract ideas.
Yes, it's a very abstract idea. I wish I could draw a picture of it, but it's like these two matrices that are intersecting with each other at a certain point. It's like motion intersecting with time. Yeah. And at that intersection, it's like taking a picture at that slice, right? And so whatever picture we take, whatever observation we take at each moment in time, is always going to be less than the waves. That's the main idea of it.
Yeah, I see. I think I see what you mean. There's a certain relating that back to a person's experience of reality.
Yeah, that'd be good.
It seems like, you know, maybe that's the way we were at one time. Adam is in that, you know, without the knowledge of the dualities of things, and there was this bliss and this joy and pleasure in things, no past and no future, just all now, you know. But maybe that's one way to look at it. But now we're aware of more than that. We're aware of the duality of things and good and evil and everything that's all the opposites that can be categorized in a gross way as good or evil. But it seems like there's a state of mind or state of being that, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but that we can get to, where we can sort of in moments have the experience of the unfolding of things in the moment as they are, with no past and no future. And it's a very blissful experience. You know, maybe it's just like a little bit of maybe that's the space that is in that wall that you're describing, or in the field, in that liminal space between past and future, that that's the appeal of non-duality, or the non-dual state of consciousness. I don't know if I'm making a leap here, but it in relating that, what you're speaking of, to maybe an experience of consciousness or not.
Well, I just do the thinking. I leave it to you guys to make sense of it.
That reminded me of, I think it was in Screw Tape Letters. C.S. Lewis said something about that God's concern is for humans is that they only ever have in mind two things, which are now and eternity. And that the enemy, like, it's makes its way in kind of like the letters between the various demons in Screw Tape Letters, that their goals are kind of to manipulate and get them to think more about the past or the future, in terms of, you know, how they make decisions and what they do.
Wow, that's really,
I like it.
that's really good.
Now or eternity.
Because now is the only time when you can do anything.
That's exactly what the scientists don't want to think about, right? The scientists don't want to think about now and eternity. They only want to think about the past and the future.
Yeah, cause and effect. That's right.
Well, I'm even hearing a lot of them talk now about how there is no such thing as causality. I mean, they're really getting reductionist, you know. There's no causality, there's no reality, there's no...
Yeah. Well, it's like they'll either get to the point to where everything is completely deconstructed into nothingness, or they'll build such a convincing simulacrum of reality that we won't be able to tell the difference, except for one thing, that it won't be real, whatever that means. But, you know, it won't be I mean, I think I know what it means, but it won't have God in it, for one thing. And maybe that's the difference. But,
I have less confidence in our ability to build these kind of simulations. I'm interested to see how we go down these paths of doing that. I'm interested, like John Vervaeke, in some of, I don't know if you follow with him, but in some of his recent lectures, he's hammering on like, oh, well, general AI is going to come here and it's going to shake everybody up. And I'm like, we use AI in the field I'm in, and I don't see there's absolutely zero evidence to me of general AI coming anytime soon. I just don't. We struggle to do. There's lots of cool things you can do with AI, but like it's it's all within a kind of repeatable nature, and you have to have tons and tons and tons of data to train this. And once you've trained it in a very specific way. You haven't done anything that you would call general intelligence, or or something that you could think of, something that has agency or consciousness or any of that. Like I'm curious what he's a cognitive scientist. So I don't know if he's looking at other things that are more interesting than what I'm seeing, but I don't see anything coming anytime soon.
Did you, either one of you, happen to see the rather long video of John Lennox addressing general AI?
No, I didn't. Is that recently?
Nope.
It's really good. Probably a year ago.
What
I'll
was he accepting the possibility of it, or just saying that he didn't?
No, he was saying he doesn't think that there is a good possibility of it.
I don't think there is either. And it's weird to me how very intelligent people have just, like, again, it's under that rubric of progress that we're just going to get there. You're just going to just put one foot in front of the other, and eventually we get there. It's like, I see it opposite. Like, I think the more we understand life in a realistic way, the more we're going to see that combinatorial explosion of what reality underlies it, which is way, way more complex than we are giving, credit for right now.
Well, yeah, I was quite surprised because I was having some correspondence with a theoretical physicist who was working on AI, especially in the area of robotics. And he was interested in some of the discussion that I had around how I find meaning in the field of chaos in my artwork, because he thought it might be transferable to what he was doing, particularly with robots. Because when they teach a robot to do a specific task, the robot gets all this data and information on how to do this task, but then to transfer that to another task that may be similar but not exactly the same, it's like a bunch of chaos arises for the robot because it doesn't have sufficient data anymore to manage this new task. And so how is the robot supposed to be able to see what part of that field of information is suited to what the robot is supposed to be doing?
It's the framing problem.
Yeah. So
what do you focus on?
And so I was having some pretty long discussions with him about that, but eventually, in order to have the discussion, he had to try to teach me so much about physics. I think he gave up and I gave up. But it did make me realize that AI is way, way simpler right now than what they usually talk about. I mean, they usually make it sound as though we're right on the verge of having this machine intelligence that can sit down and have discussions like this.
Well, the thing is, theoretically, we got plenty of computational power to throw at the problem. I mean, there's no lack of that. So it's not like, I mean, we theoretically we exceed, the capacity of a human brain many times over with what we're able to do with just raw processing power. But in terms of how it's organized, I don't see any. I mean, we're just taking mathematical and statistical models of, like, how to understand a big set of data, and trying to get generalized principles out of that big set of data that get applied to the what a particular software or robot does. So, which is not how we proceed at all. It seems like what we do in real time, we can't really. We still haven't struggling to model. And for me, I'm like, okay, we should set our sights much lower. Like, we should see if we could even, like, model like a single bacterial cell. We don't seem to be capable of even doing that yet. So
when John Hegel and Henry Stapp were talking about the mind-brain interface, they were talking about mind as being like, that's who you really are. And the way they were describing it is kind of what I've talked about in the past, is like this idea about each of us having experiential DNA. all of my life experiences and all of the books I've read and the people I've met and all my relationships and all my thoughts and all the songs I've heard, that's who makes me who I am. So my mind is unique in the way that my mind interfaces with my brain compared to your mind interfacing with your brain, because your mind is unique as well. So the mind is the observer back here, and the brain has all the data, has all the information. Even the brain can even see all the possibilities and the potentiality arise up in front of it. But something has to make decisions, and that's the mind. But the mind is a lived experience. It's a life that has been lived out, where information has been tried and found wanting, or tried and found to be successful throughout an entire lifetime. And then that's the mind that makes the decision about which potentiality to pursue. But with AI, there's no mind. There's just information, which kind of takes us back to where we started in this conversation. So maybe that's a good place to roll it up. Do you guys have any last words about that?
One thing I thought was when you're talking about all your different experiences at once, that it reminded me of that clip you sent me of Eleanor Stump. I found that really interesting, where she was talking about how God, because he's outside of time, interacts at the same time, like simultaneously, with not just who you are now, but all your experiences, both past and future. Mm-hmm. And because of that, has an intimacy of understanding and closeness to us that is, you can't model or just can't be experienced with any human relationship.
Yeah, I will link to that video too. That was a really good one.
Mm-hmm. I guess the only closing thing I might say regarding artificial intelligence is that it doesn't have to be that good for us to. I mean, we're already using it, as you mentioned, Michael. I'm using it. I see it being used in my work too, although I don't do that personally. But I guess my concern or prediction is that it would be at some point, and maybe it's not that far from now, that we will perhaps look to it for an aid in governance, and so to help make decisions about sort of governing type decisions.
Yeah, kind of like we do with science now, where
exactly,
which science is no way within its purview to make those kind of decisions, but because we have this high status for science, we go, oh, you're scientifically minded, you should make the decision.
Exactly, and I can see how, that if we could get, if there was a point at which the masses of voters would be willing to put their trust in maybe not AI directly, but through a committee of politicians who consulted with AI, over time, that there could be, because the advantage of AI is that it can consider a lot more possibilities and probabilities than the human mind is capable of. That's why it can beat people at Go and chess and things like that. So I can just see that over time, at this gradual transition to where we become more and more looking toward AI, or looking towards our politicians to utilize AI in specific, and then maybe more and more general decisions about allocation of resources and things like that, because there'll be a perceived impartiality and to that technology.
I'll just plug real quickly. There's a show based on this premise. It's a Japanese anime called Psychopaths. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it, but it's really good because it's like, it just goes into the philosophical problems of having your society run by this AI that in all, on the surface levels, it produced all this peace and prosperity. It predicts when somebody's going to become a criminal and takes care of them before anything happens and all this. But it's interesting because the show is basically about all the the philosophical questions of what does it mean to be human in this society.
Yeah, interesting. I'd like to check that out.
Yeah, could you send me a link to it, Michael?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a cartoon. It's a Japanese anime, but I think it's really well done.
Yeah, and so if you guys have any other links that you want me to put on the video under the information, I will take care of it. Sounds good. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thanks.
Awesome.
You're okay
Thanks,
if I
guys.
publish?
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
Okay, thanks. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.